As most of you here on the channel will probably know, I am a huge fan of all things driven, from cars to motorcycles, petrol to diesel, electric, hybrid, turbine, rotary. Anything that's interesting, that's different, that's wacky, has pretty much always appealed to me. And one of the things that I love to see is when a car manufacturer makes a motorbike. But even more so is when a motorcycle manufacturer tries their hand at making a car, and that doesn't happen as often. We've even talked about one of the best examples previously in this same series, the Yamaha OX-9 911, an incredible supercar concept, which unfortunately didn't really get the chance that it deserved. And if you're unfamiliar with that car, I would definitely recommend checking it out. It has more than a couple of things in common with the McLaren F1. On this occasion though, the vehicle in question is pretty different to that Yamaha. For one thing, it's designed for motorsport, not for the road. It was developed far earlier, and it's not as quick as that car. However, performance is relative, and in its own way, this car had a massive amount of potential as well. Now, the story for this vehicle, which doesn't really seem to even have a name that I could find online beyond the Kawasaki Factory Auto Racer. Snazzy name, they could have just called it the ZX440 or something, but if, incidentally, anyone does know the official name of the car, be sure to drop that down below and I can change the title. For now though, it's the Kawasaki car, and that's basically what I'm going to refer to it as. Now, as I said, the story originates in the 70s, with snowmobile racing, of all things. Kawasaki was an engine supplier in that sport, and one of their employees in the States, where incidentally they were trying to expand the brand at the time, by the name of Darrell Krause, suggested having a warmer weather option to accompany snowmobile racing, to keep the Kawasaki influence and marketing all year round. So that's exactly what they did. They tried to pioneer a small, almost like one-make style, low-cost racing series, and this was the Test Mule. They employed a race car builder by the name of Harvey Aschenbrenner to develop the machine in a very old-school sense. It had a square-tube monocoque frame, a fiberglass body built by a company just down the road, and an engine which was itself sourced from those same snowmobile efforts. A 440cc, two-stroke, twin-cylinder, with all of its power very high in the rev range, over 8,000 RPM, and it only put out 70 horses. However, the crazy thing about this car, and the reason why it had so much potential, was not because of the power, it was because of the weight. In fact, this is one of the lightest cars we've ever talked about. The entire vehicle, plus the driver, weighed 600 pounds. That's lighter than some people. 272 kilos is barely more than a lot of heavyweight motorcycles, barely more than a quarter of a metric ton. So even though it only has 70 horsepower, the horsepower per ton is remarkably good for something with that tiny little two-stroke snowmobile engine and that kind of power. And they actually did get to test the car. Now, a couple of, not necessarily mistakes, but understandable roadblocks were almost created by the project in making it, such as, for instance, the choice of a motorcycle gearbox being used, which didn't really have the right ratios for the vehicle, but of course it was trial and error at the time. There were no advanced computer simulations like we'd have now. It was, as I said, more of a trial and error thing. So they put a motorcycle gearbox into the machine, they tested it on a racetrack called Elko Speedway, which was a third of a mile long, about a 15-second lap for a fast machine, and the car did multiple laps and showed a lot of potential. After that initial test session, Aschenbrenner decided to remove that ill-suited gearbox and fit it instead with an axle clutch setup that engaged at 7,000 RPM. They then retested the car, and this is where things get good, because with that new setup, this tiny little two-stroke Kawasaki could do a lap of that circuit in 14.56 seconds. Now that without context doesn't mean very much, but the all-time lap record was 14.54. 20 milliseconds quicker, and that just so happened to be set by a V8 stock car. This is a 70 horsepower snowmobile engine go-kart, basically, which was only 0.02 off the time of a NASCAR, in effect, at the time. But it's at this point where unfortunately the pencil pushers got in the way, for understandable reasons, but still reasons nonetheless. Kawasaki gave them a call and said that the car needed to be ready for a motorcycle event to promo the vehicle at none other than Laguna Seca. He had 2 weeks to get that done, and that was an issue because he was planning to improve the car further with a torque converter instead of that axle clutch. Now they managed to get it done, plus they had to make an improvised trailer to get the car to Laguna Seca, but they did manage to do it. Unfortunately, on day 1 at Laguna Seca, it blew its engine. Now they found a replacement, fitted it, but ultimately the car was kind of crippled, and again, it wasn't even tested ahead of time, so it was no surprise, and it ended up doing a couple of laps at about 50 miles an hour. However, it still attracted a ton of attention, which is no surprise. I mean, it's an impressive looking little car, and of course, the potential is clearly seen, and certainly would have been at the time as well. And unfortunately, the project was ultimately dropped. Now, Kawasaki decided that his talents, along with Darrell Krause as well, were best suited elsewhere, and they left the car and the potential of that one-make series in the hands of a partner. Ultimately, it didn't go anywhere, and I think that's a shame, because this car had so much potential. A relatively unassuming spec, but look what it could do with that spec. What a literal underdog with incredible performance, albeit on a very small oval circuit, but still being that close to a NASCAR on any circuit is promise if I've ever seen it, and as far as my research could show, this is still the only real time that Kawasaki has officially turned their attention to trying to make a car. Plenty of aftermarket upgraded cars have, of course, used Kawasaki engine swaps, but it's hardly the same thing. To me, this is certainly a worthy car of Unsung Heroes. It ticks all of the boxes. Easily forgotten, rarely heard of, wacky certainly, definitely an underdog, and something which was cut down before its prime. If they'd have just had a little bit longer to develop the car, and maybe just kept the project going instead of dropping it, who knows what it could have become. Ultimately though, that's it for this installment, so of course if you're new to the channel and this is your first episode of Unsung Heroes, I would urge you to click on the playlist here on screen and check out the previous ones because there are plenty of very interesting cars that we've talked about, and of course if you want to vote for this car as one of your favourites of the episodes, then of course click the link down below, jump over to the Discord server and vote for the car. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.